Thank you, Professor Tom, for your excellent and brilliant lecture. Now we have some time for short questions, and I suggest that we collect 2 or 3 questions and then allow Professor Tom to answer them.
My question is that, is there an Islamist movement in Turkey today that really follows Said Badi'al-Zaman, Said Nursi's thoughts and legacy? And if yes, what makes it different from the other Islamic movements in the world? For example, Muslim Brotherhood or Jamaat Islami by Abdul Ala Maududi and Muslim Brotherhood by Hassan al-Banna. Thank you.
Professor, I want to ask you, what's his take on the mission, the sense of spreading the faith, in this case Islam, and the peace building in light of Christian Muslim relationship or other faith relationship with Islam?
By reading the Risale-i, the part I could read, preparing my work on Gulen, I noticed that the framework, the structure of the Risale-i is very similar to the Tafsir al-Manar, the way it proceeds. And also there is both the attempt to respond to the quest for modernizing Islam or the challenge of modernity. However, I found a big difference in the spiritual attitude. I found in Tafsir al-Manar less presence of the spirit that animates Sayyid Nursi. Would you agree on that, and can you comment on that?
Okay. So the first question was, is there an Islamic movement? Well, yeah, there's somewhere between 5 and 12 million people, depending on what level of involvement you would want, who read and study and try to live the Quranic teaching according to the Risale-i Nur. And as I mentioned, they do this in Ankara. When I was living there were probably about 40 groups that would be meeting in the course of a single week. And they might have anywhere from between 15 or 20 to 45 or 50 people. Now, this is not a movement like it in organized in any way. That's why you can't come down with any numbers and say there's this many people who are followers. Because some people, their commitment is deeper. I was near Erzurum a few years ago and invited to a place where young people, I guess there were about 50 young people living in a big house. And what they do all day long is study the Risale-i Nur. They haven't gotten married. So what they do generally when they finish their schooling after high school or college, they make a decision. They're either going to get a job and get married, raise a family, or some of them will feel called to what they call waqf, to making a donation of their life to the study of the Quran through the Risale-i Nur, and that's what these people were doing. Well, that's a really strong commitment, as you can see. It's sort of like becoming a monk, for the rest of your life. There's other people who will just have their normal job. They'll have a shop, or they'll be in a government ministry, and once a week they'll come and they'll in the evening they'll get together and they'll study the Risale-i Nur and try to live as better Muslims because of it. But they've never formed a political party, if that's what you're driving at. Now, there was, Dr. Zanini mentioned the Gulen movement. The Gulen movement is one of the manifestations of those who study the Risale-i Nur. Sociologists name there's about 8 or 9 different groups. And they're all slightly different takes on the Risale-i Nur. Some would be very close to the original message, and they wouldn't try to develop it. Where the Gulen movement, they'll take kind of a more creative, you might say, approach to it, and they'll try to make institutions that will apply the goals, you know, that'll try to fight ignorance and poverty and disunity by institute. Well, some of the others will say that was not Nursi's idea. His idea was that the only thing that's going to make any changes in this world is when this individual Muslim becomes a real Muslim. And when that happens, and when enough people do that, society is going to be different. They say that was the original. I think that's probably correct. That was closest to, say, Nursi's original thinking. So he was very skeptical of institutions. He said they don't do it. You need unless you have the internal transformation, you're not going to get anywhere. So the second one, was he trying to spread the faith? Well, remember where he's living. He's 99.99% of the people he's meeting all the time are Muslims. He's living as he's imprisoned, in a small town in central Anatolia. And what he's trying to do is to get Muslims who are Muslims because their parents were Muslim and they were raised Muslim, but maybe they pray sometimes. But he wants them to really see what is involved in the teaching of the Quran and let it change their lives. So in this way, he's spreading the faith, yes. In terms of having a missionary wing that goes out and sends people, he's not like the Tabligh. You know, the Tabligh, they have a missionary duty and they must go and they must try to make others become good Muslims. He wasn't thinking of that. He was thinking of mainly his Turkish society that was getting more and more secular, certainly the government and the school system quite secular. And he was saying, you know, we're going to lose our faith. And that's his main concern. The third one was when you asked about the challenge of modernity. This was the big thing. See, Ataturk and the founders of the Turkish Republic, they were pretty much convinced that what was holding them back as a nation, as a people, was all the medieval trappings of Islam. And he said, they were saying, what countries are successful today? Well, England is successful, Germany is successful, France is successful. That's who we have to be like. So they adopt the Swiss civil code, they adopt the Italian criminal code because these were seen to be the most modern. Well, Nursi saw his job as saying, watch out, you know, modernity is not the answer. Modernity is creating its own problems. And so he sees modernity as being part of the problem rather than the answer to things. And so he's trying to convince other Turks that, yeah, that the answer comes from an enlightened understanding of the Quran. An understanding of the Quran that's not just trying to hold on to a bunch of medieval traditions, but that is trying to guide people and show people how to live. That's what is the thrust of his work. And until ordinary Muslims undergo an inner transformation, become real Muslims who understand their faith and live their faith, nothing's going to change.
Thank you very much for your very enlightened presentation. I have two sets of questions. The first one relates with your reference to Shawaliullah and Sheikh Ahmad in the context of South Asia, and especially in the context of the Deobandi school. I was just wondering how would you relate Shawaliullah's efforts in sort of, you know, setting the way for a reformist Islam, and specifically with regards to his ideas and opinions about the issue of bid'ah. And then I was also wondering what you have to say about this wave of Salafi and the Deobandi school. How would you contemplate on the issue of contemporary Salafism and that of Deobandi Islam, which is in the West we see that there is a lot of emphasis, overemphasized sort of contextualization of Salafi Islam compared to the Deobandi. So I'd like to hear some.
Thank you. Okay. Jason.
You've spoken about informal study circles that still look at the Risale and Nur. In Nursi's vision, what style of study? I mean, what sorts of relationships in the context of study facilitate learning and facilitate ikhlas? If he was skeptical about institutions, I mean, is one-on-one study with a master the best? Is it a small circle? Is it something this size? Or is it a university? What relationships help us learn for him?
Thank you.
Thank you, Father, for your beautiful sharing. Could you say something about the influence of the thoughts and writings of Sayyid Nursi on Muslims outside Turkey? Thank you.
Thank you. Tom.
Okay, first of all, to my sister, you got me stumped. I would hate to, I'm sure you know more about Shah Waliullah and Ahmad Sirhindi than I do. I mentioned them, and Shah Waliullah not so much, but certainly Sayyid Nursi, he was impressed by Sirhindi, and he, one way that you would see the influence of Sirhindi upon him was the whole idea of wahdat al-shuhud. So kind of the oneness of reality in a psychological sense rather than in an ontological sense. But he refers to him a lot more, and in the question that you're asking about how they are trying to renew the Islamic community, I have to say, plead ignorance and say I can't answer your question. Although it's a really good question. So that's about that. And then the Salaf. He didn't talk much about the Salaf. Certainly the Wahhabi Salafi tradition was growing up in Arabia, and it was spreading around the world before his time, but he doesn't refer to it very much at all. I don't know whether it just didn't have much influence in Turkey at that time. He doesn't praise it or consider himself part of it. He doesn't criticize it. It's just, you look through the Risale-i Nur, I think a word study probably wouldn't turn up Salaf. I stand corrected, but as far as I can tell, I don't see much reference. Well, of course, the interesting for that is that for us today, looking 50 years after his death, we're thinking, how can somebody ignore such an important and central movement, to be neither defending it or attacking it or whatever. But in his day, it just must not have been that much on people's minds, at least in Central and Eastern Anatolia. Study circle. This is pretty much the way the Risale-i Nur grew. He would get about 15 or 20 students. People loved to take pictures of them. And you'll see them sitting out under a tree on a sunny day, and you'll be sitting there in the middle of them, cross-legged, and they'll be in a halaqah around him, and they'll be asking him questions. And they'll say, well, how do you explain God's goodness? We just had these terrible floods. So then he'll give an answer to the question that they ask. Or what can you say about the Dajjal? Is the Dajjal coming, or is the Dajjal already here? And then he would give a kind of like a treatise of the Dajjal. They would write down the notes sometimes. He would write down his own notes afterwards. And so it kind of grew up in this informal master and student relationship, a study circle, I guess would be the Muslims outside of Turkey. Well, of course, the Risale-i Nur was brought by Turks to various parts of the world. At various times in the past 20 years, I've been invited to give talks on the Risale-i Nur in Indonesia. We had a number of talks. Much of the Risale-i Nur has been translated into Bahasa Indonesia. We had a thing in the Philippines, in Cagayan de Oro. Were you there, sister? No. We did. Well, we did. And then in Malaysia. So Southeast Asia, certainly we've had these meetings. Now, many Turks, of course, who emigrated to Europe, to Holland and to Belgium and to Germany, they brought the Risale-i Nur with them, and they have study circles. In Washington at Georgetown University, we had a group of about 5 or 6 that would study the Risale-i Nur. I was invited and took part a number of times. Some were Muslims, some were not Muslims. And so I would imagine that any big university town in the United States that has Turks probably has some people who are wanting to introduce people to the study of the Risale-i Nur. So yes, Central Asia would be another big source. We had a meeting in India, I remember, in Delhi, and in a school down in the south, in Cochin. So yeah, there are study circles going on outside of Turkey, mainly brought by Turks.
Thank you very much, Father, for the enriching lecture. Just one question. If there were one thing that you would like to refute in Sayyid Nursi's ideas, or something you do not agree with, there's something about that. Or whether he's somewhere we can say weak, or the argument is weak.
Yeah.
If there's something, thank you.
Yeah, that's really a good question, see, because it's kind of a double question. As a Christian, my belief in what God does and has done and is doing, is going to do, is different from, say, Nursi, because he's Muslim. But I've often asked myself, if I were a Muslim, would I be convinced by, say, Nursi? Would I want to? I guess what I find methodologically the weakest are his stories. He tells a lot of kind of involved parables that I find myself getting kind of antsy. They don't really convince me. I don't know. What do you think, Janab? The stories that he tells, do you like them? Do you get a lot out of them?
Sometimes we have to maybe cultural context, anatomic context, maybe, depends, but just mentioned Barla, he has a different environment.
Yeah, but he'll tell these stories. 2 men go into this luxurious palace. And, oh, not another luxurious palace. That's not my life. So I find myself methodologically kind of tuning out in some of the stories, and to get the meat out of it sometimes is kind of hard to do. I think that sometimes when he's talking about, and so this would be in the teaching part, when he's talking about bad things that happen, whether it's earthquake and floods, and so natural disasters that people are suffering from, or bad diseases, I think sometimes he doesn't take seriously enough the suffering that people are going through, and that words don't really, they don't really do it, you know. If you're a refugee in a refugee camp and it looks like your future is you're never going to get out of it, you can't say to people, well, think of this as an opportunity to learn patience. You know, it doesn't do it. It doesn't respond to their needs at the time. I think sometimes I feel that when I read the things that he writes.
You mentioned the 6,000 pages of the commentaries. Would you say they were written by himself, or are they written by other people with him? How did he go about it? And what about sources? Did he?
Yeah, well, it's good. I think his sources must have come from his early years. I've never read anybody who said what kind of library he had with him in Barla. Now, all the sources say that he had a terrific memory, and in his early years, when he studied, his teachers were mostly Naqshbandis, but he, for some reason, decided not to join them, to not be Naqshbandi himself. But he does speak about people like Ahmad Sirhindi with a knowledge of them. He also knows and quotes people like Jalaluddin Rumi, Mevlana, and he knows both also the more popular poets like Yunus Emre. He will cite them from the Turkish tradition. But what kind of books he had, I've read a lot of stuff about him, but I've never really read anything like that. Your earlier question was, how much did he write? He wrote a lot of it himself, and his students wrote a lot of it. They wrote a lot of it during his talks, because it'll say the sheikh was asked, and then he answered, or Hoja replied, and then it'll go on with his answer. So obviously that was not written by himself. And it's also kind of put together, see, he kept changing it all through his life. He kept revising it. So like the Damascus sermon, which was a beautiful sermon he gave, I think 1912, if I'm not mistaken, still in Ottoman times in Damascus. He looked at it again after World War II, 1947, 1948. He had done the original in Arabic, and then in 1947 he picked it up again and he updated it. And he did the second version in Turkish. So at this time, you know, it's a whole different social situation. It's no longer the Ottoman Empire. It's the Soviet, it's the communist thing after World War II, which is right across the border. And so he's very much concerned about that. Many of he'll say things like, at one point he's talking about Christian missionaries. He says the Christian missionaries and good Muslims have to unite against the current from the north. Well, that's obviously Russian communism. So he's rewriting and revising his stuff all the way through. So I think for a literary historian, it's a nightmare, you know, trying to figure out what was written when and where and by whom. And so all you can do is to take it as this is his final testament of his life, and it came from really over the course of 60 years. His earliest things, I think, maybe was when he was still as a cavalry officer against the Russians. No, that's 1917. So 1911 might be the earliest trainings.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have two questions, small ones. The first one is it true that Nursi views of Christology is different from the traditional Muslim ones? And the second one is it also true that many Muslims in Arab countries, they think that Nursi represents the movement against the Arabic domination. So like this today, people blame him for the fact we have many Turks refuse to go to the Quran or to read the tafsir of Nursi because it's enough. So like, you know, this Arabic domination, we don't like it, we have our own, you know, Turkish language, we can go through it, read the Quran, read the Turkish interpretation, tafsir, like these two questions. Thank you.
Well, the first thing to remember, of course, is that Nursi was not a Turk. He was a Kurd, which for Kurds is different. And in fact, in many reports, he's called Sayyid al-Kurdi. And many Kurdish nationalists feel that the reason why he was exiled to Barla in the first place was not because of his views of the Quran or his disagreement with Ataturk, but because he was a Kurd and they wanted to get him out of the Kurdish area. Let's remember that. Now I can remember reading though. You know, he says, people ask me whether I'm a Kurdish nationalist. He says, no, I'm a Muslim. So he always saw this kind of ethnic nationalism as a kind of rival to real Islam. So he never would support those who were saying that. You asked about his views of Christianity. He did accept some hadith about the end time, eschatological hadith, that were rather weak. You'll remember the four sound hadiths about the return of Jesus and the Dajjal, and Jesus is going to defeat the Dajjal. Well, there's also some weaker hadiths about the return of Sufyan. And he will talk about Sufyan as being at work to try to make Muslims apostatize and turn away from Islam, just as Dajjal is going, the Antichrist, is going to try to make Christians turn away from Christ. But he foresees in the end time Christ and Mahdi joining up to defeat these forces of evil. Now, another thing that he does that many scriptural scholars, Muslim scholars, would not do, is he sees Jesus and Dajjal, or the Antichrist, and Sufyan and Mahdi, not as individuals, but as corporate personalities. So when he talks about the return of Jesus, he's talking about those Christians who are following truly the teachings of Jesus. And Mahdi is that community of Muslims who are remaining faithful for the true Islam. So talking about these two joining up, he's saying that real Christians and real Muslims are going to unite to defeat Dajjal, and Sufyan are also not individuals but corporate personalities. So they're going to defeat what we might call the forces of unbelief and wrongdoing. Now, a lot of this, many Muslims would not accept, because the hadiths about Sufyan are rather weak. And according to some Muslims, my professor, for example, he doesn't accept the four hadiths about Dajjal and the return of Jesus either. So many Muslims would not accept his eschatological view. But he tries to stay always based on hadith when he's talking about Jesus. So he doesn't go off into flights of fancy, no.
Thank you, Gina. The last question.
That's very the Pontifical Institution. I'm curious because, as you have mentioned, he couldn't have the chance to meet people of other faiths. But whatever we know is, I'm also curious, I don't know the details. You know that through the apostolic delegate in Istanbul, he sent some of books, or one book, to PISAI. I'm not sure about the details. Could you give more into that?
Well, some years ago when I was working for Monsignor Fitzgerald, I was asked to see if I could find out anything about that, because it's true that he sent, as a gift, some part of the Risale-i to Pope Pius XII. Now, I don't know what language. I guess this was in the old Turkish that it's written in, and I don't think anybody in Rome would have known how to read it. But so we asked in the archive, can you find it? Because we had the dates, I think it's 1954. And they said they looked and they couldn't find it, which I'm really not surprised. It was a long time ago and there were no good filing system and the like. So, but what they did do is the Pope sent a letter of thanks back to Sayyid Nursi, and we still have that, not the original, but we have it reprinted in some of the early editions of the Risale-i Nur, or in Turkish, but there will be this letter in Latin from Pius XII to Nursi thanking him for the copy. So we know that it's not just a myth, that he actually did do that. And also I should note that he kind of shocked some of the more conservative elements of Turkish society by visiting the ecumenical patriarch in Istanbul, when that was not really considered a proper thing for a Muslim scholar to do.
Two last questions.
Just very little questions too. The first, I am curious to know the reaction of his disciples when he spoke about, when he mentioned the three enemies of Islam. The second question is that speaking about spending the time, the energy for studying the Quran, that means that he ignored or he minimized the idea of jihad.
Very good. Oh, wait a minute.
Another one.
Jihad.
The last.
First one.
The three enemies of Islam.
Three enemies.
Okay, Celestine.
Thank you for the wonderful exposition. Yeah, I would like to know how he would have reacted to the recent uprising in Islam in terms of terrorism. And it's interesting the way he addressed the issue of modernity and his point on non-violent resistance. In spite of all the incarcerations in prison, he was not violent. It's very interesting. Where did he actually draw his strength of this teaching? Is it from the hadith or from the history of Islam? And what do you think he would say about the reactions to injustice in the violent way the terrorists are doing today?
Okay.
The first one, when he talks about the three enemies of Islam, which are poverty, ignorance, and disunity, yes, they very much take that up. So many of them have really given their lives as teachers, fighting ignorance, working in many ways to overcome disunity among peoples. Now, I think that the one group of the followers of Sayyid Nursi, the Gülen movement, they have taken this up almost explicitly. They have thousands of schools around the world. And it's over 1,000, I don't know how many. But it's these schools, as well as their publications of magazines. They have lots of professional magazines, popular magazines, are all aimed at overcoming ignorance. They try to overcome disunity. They have dialogue groups. There's no group of people in the world that has given more time and energy and funding to dialogue groups. I think in the United States there's about 200 of them. That's only one country. So if we add to that Germany and France and Belgium and England and all the others, this is a lot of effort to try to. I was in Paterson, New Jersey, some years ago, and I was talking to the Catholic priest there, the parish priest, and he says, you know, these Turks have really transformed our town. He says, the first time I ever met the Jewish rabbi was at the Turkish Cultural Center. Well, it shows that when a group of people, a small people, immigrants, but if they're really convinced that something is worth doing, they can accomplish something. So they really have done a lot of that. They have, in the past 10 or 15 years, what they call Kimsi Yogu. I was in Kenya, in a real rural, deserted place in the desert, and here there were 3 Turkish doctors and 4 Turkish nurses with a free clinic, and they said, well, we came here because there really was no medical service available. Why are they doing it? Well, because they have a commitment to fight against poverty, and so they're doing that. So yes, they do believe it. And jihad. Yes, he's a firm believer in jihad. He says the days of jihad by the sword are over, if they ever were existing. He says what we need now is jihad by the word. In other words, for him, jihad is trying to convince people to live as good believers in God and to do what God wants. And all you can do is try to convince people. It's jihad of the word now. He says the days of armed jihad is over. And what would he say about injustice? Kind of hard knowing what somebody would say, today. Certainly he spoke out against the injustice in his own society. If you read the Damascus sermon, if a non-Muslim wrote that, people would say, oh, this guy is just kind of harping criticism. But it's written by a Muslim, and he's trying to tell other Muslims, he says, you really don't have good societies. You're not living like Muslims. And one of the points that he brings up is just the blatant injustice that he finds in a lot of societies. He must have had some strong reactions, I imagine, in Damascus when he first said that. So I think our time is up, maybe.
Yes.
Thank you.
I just mentioned that the next public lecture will be in French, exactly in 4 weeks, on Thursday, 23rd March. Professor Ahmed Bouyarden will speak about the theme Abdelkader, humanisme et humanité en islam. Vous êtes tous invités. So I thank you, Tom. Thank you, Professor Morelli. I thank you all for your presence and your participation, and I wish you a pleasant evening.